Did you know the US Constitution doesn't guarantee a right to education? How does this oversight impact the quality and accessibility of education across America? Would dismantling the US Department of Education lead to innovation and efficiency, or open the floodgates to corruption and inequality? Is federal oversight a safeguard or a shackle? Are international test scores, like PISA, an accurate reflection of US educational standards, or do they unfairly rank our students due to social and economic disparities? Could focusing on these scores be misleading policymakers?
Welcome back to the Mass Debate channel. In this episode, we dive into the heart of American education controversies. Discover hidden truths about our Constitution and debate the future of our schools. Like, subscribe, and comment to join the conversation. Welcome to the Mass Debate channel, deep dives into meaty matters, where we explore the bold and unexpected moves in politics and everything else. In this
All right, so we're diving into something pretty big this time.
Yeah.
The U.S. Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hot topic these days.
Oh, for sure.
Especially with all the talk about maybe shutting it down.
Yeah, no kidding.
And you know what's really cool?
What's that?
You sent in a ton of stuff on this.
Wow.
Really interesting stuff.
Like what?
Well, we've got news segments, policy papers, even legal analyses.
No way.
Yeah. And get this. There's even some really passionate discussions from teachers themselves.
Sounds intense.
It is, in a good way, though.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So we're going to go deep, really understand all sides of this whole Department of Education thing.
So, what does the department actually do?
Yeah, exactly. And should it even exist?
Big questions.
Big questions indeed.
You know, it kind of feels like we're at a crossroads.
Totally.
I mean, is the U.S. Department of Education actually doing what it's supposed to?
Right. And if not, what's the best way to move forward with education in America?
Yeah, how do we make things better for students and teachers?
Exactly. And with all these sources you sent, we have a lot to unpack here.
We sure do.
Okay, so remember that whole thing with former President Trump?
The one where you wanted to get rid of the Department of Education?
Yeah, that's the one. We even have this news segment from Reason TV about it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It's pretty lively, covers a lot of different reactions to his plan.
From who?
Oh, from all sorts of folks, like Elon Musk to teachers sounding off on Reddit.
Oh, wow. So it's not just politicians chiming in.
Nope, not at all. It's a real powder keg of opinions.
I bet.
So let's talk about Trump's plan for a sec.
All right, let's do it.
It wasn't just about shutting down the department.
There's more.
Oh, yeah.
What else was he pushing for?
Well, the Wall Street Journal covered it, and it's also highlighted in that Reason TV segment.
Okay, remind me.
So, on top of dismantling the department, he was advocating for things like universal school choice. And, a big push against what he called, quote, woke teachings.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention.
For sure. Now, I gotta ask about this whole woke teachings thing.
I figured you might.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, good question.
It seems like everyone's using that term, but I'm not sure everyone's on the same page.
You're telling me it's a really loaded term for sure.
So, what are people actually talking about when they say woke teachings?
Well, for some folks,
Okay.
it's about what they see as too much focus on things like systemic racism, gender identity, social justice, stuff like that.
Oh, I see.
They argue that those topics are maybe inappropriate for young kids or that they're divisive.
Interesting.
Some even say it's pushing a certain political agenda.
Makes sense.
But then you have others who say, hold on a second. These topics are crucial for understanding history and society, ourselves even.
Right, you can't just ignore them.
Exactly. They argue that these topics actually promote empathy and critical thinking.
So it's like this back and forth between folks who want to stick to what they see as traditional education.
Right.
And those who think we need to, broaden the scope of what's taught in schools.
You got it. It's a real tug of war, and that's why people are so fired up about it.
No wonder. So where does Trump fit into all of this?
Well, his plan really tapped into that tension we were just talking about.
Okay, how so?
He even wanted to use federal funding as leverage.
To do what?
To influence school policies on things like transgender accommodations and critical race theory.
Wow, so really specific policies.
Uh-huh. And that definitely poured fuel on the fire.
Makes sense.
It became a flashpoint in the debate about what should be taught in schools.
And what about the reactions to Trump's plan?
Oh, they were all over the place.
I bet. I mean, we see it in that Reason TV clip, right? Like,
Yeah.
Rick Scott, he's all for states taking control of education.
Right. Less federal involvement.
And then you have Elon Musk.
He just retweeted in support of Trump's plan.
Yeah, pretty simple endorsement there.
Kept it short and sweet.
And then there's Betsy DeVos.
Trump's own Secretary of Education.
Exactly. She had some thoughts too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
What was her stance?
Well, she actually supports closing the Department of Education.
Really?
Yeah, but she says it doesn't mean the end of public education funding.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
For sure. She's more about shifting control away from the federal government.
And giving it back to the states.
Exactly.
So that brings us to the real heart of the matter.
What's that?
What is the Department of Education's role?
Yeah, and how did we even end up with this whole system in the first place?
Thankfully, you included some sources that can help us answer those very questions.
Yeah, all right, let's see what they say.
First up, we've got the Department of Education's own website.
Straight from the horse's mouth, huh?
You got it. And it actually lays out its mission pretty clearly.
What does that say?
Promoting educational excellence and ensuring equal access to public schooling for all students.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, on the surface.
But there's always more to it, isn't there?
You know it. Now, remember that Ballotpedia entry you sent?
Oh, yeah, that one was interesting.
If you dig into it, you'll see that the department is actually a pretty recent addition.
Recent? Like how recent?
It was established in 1980.
Wow, so it hasn't even been around for 50 years.
Nope. Before that, it was all part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Huh, so they split it up.
Yep, carved out education as its own thing.
I wonder why they made that change.
You and me both. I mean, that probably explains why this whole debate about federal versus state control is so heated.
Yeah, it's like it's baked into the very structure of how we've traditionally thought about education in America.
Right. Like, is there a right way to do it?
Big question. And, you know, that Ballotpedia entry also highlights something pretty noteworthy.
What's that?
During the Trump administration, they rescinded a whole bunch of Obama-era guidance documents.
Guidance documents about what?
College admissions. They encouraged colleges to consider race as a factor in admissions.
Okay, so this is getting into affirmative action territory.
Exactly.
And Trump's administration basically said, nope, we're not doing that anymore.
Yep, they reversed course.
It's a clear example of how different administrations can use the Department of Education to, like, really influence things.
To shape educational policy, for sure.
Yeah, to push their own agendas even.
So it's not just about whether the department exists, but also how it uses its power.
Exactly. And now for something completely different.
Which are...
This report from the Education Commission of the states.
Ooh, sounds official.
It is. And
Yeah.
they get into this whole world of education provisions within state constitutions.
Like what the states themselves say about education?
Yeah, and let me tell you, it gets pretty wild.
I bet it does.
So much variation from state to state.
What do you mean?
Like the way they talk about education, the requirements they set, it's all over the map.
So different states have different visions for education.
You got it. And honestly, some of the language in these constitutions feels like it's stuck in the past. Well, they point out this example,
Okay.
Alabama's constitution. It still includes language about segregated schools.
Seriously. In this day and age.
I know, right? Crazy.
So are they still segregating schools in Alabama?
No, of course not. Federal law overrides that outdated language.
Okay, good.
But it's a reminder of how much history is, like, embedded in these state-level approaches to education.
It makes you wonder if some states are really equipped to ensure equal access to quality education for everyone.
That's the million-dollar question. Do we need the federal government to step in?
Or will state and local control lead to more innovation, maybe better responses to community needs?
Tough call, right?
It is. And you know, there's this case they highlight in the report.
Oh, yeah.
Campbell County School District v. State in Wyoming.
Okay, what happened there?
So the state Supreme Court actually ruled that the school districts there weren't meeting the constitutional requirement.
For what?
A complete and uniform system of public instruction.
Wow, so even when a state has good intentions, there can still be debate about whether they're actually delivering on their promises.
Exactly. And that tension between state autonomy and federal oversight.
Yeah.
It's at the very core of this whole Department of Education debate.
Makes sense. Okay, so now we're getting into the arguments for and against a federal right to education, right?
Got it.
And that Teaching Channel blog post you sent really dives into that.
Yeah, it's a good one.
They use this example, a real-world one,
Oh, I like that.
about two schools in Elgin, Illinois,
Okay.
Ronald D. O'Neill Elementary
Got it.
and Centennial Elementary.
Two different schools, same town?
Yep, same district even.
So what's the story?
Oh, O'Neill is a school where most of the kids come from low-income families,
Oh,
and a lot of them are still learning English.
So they face some extra challenges.
Absolutely. And back in 2019,
Okay.
their third graders did really poorly on standardized reading and writing tests.
Oh, no, how poorly?
Like, not a single student tested at grade level.
That's rough.
It is
What about the other school, Centennial?
totally different story.
Right.
Way more kids are passing those same tests.
So two schools, same district, vastly different outcomes.
Yep. And it gets even more interesting.
How so?
Centennial, the school with the higher test scores, they're actually getting more funding per student than O'Neill.
Wait, seriously? The school that's already doing better gets more money.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
That's crazy. So why is that? Why the funding disparity?
The blog post digs into that.
What's the reason?
A big chunk of school funding comes from local property taxes.
Ah, so it depends on the neighborhood.
Exactly. In wealthier areas where property values are higher,
Like where Centennial is probably.
yep, those schools end up with more resources.
And schools in lower income areas like O'Neill.
They struggle to make ends meet.
That's a vicious cycle.
It is. The schools that need the most help often get the least.
And that's what people who support a stronger federal role in education point to, right?
Exactly. They say relying on local property taxes to fund schools just creates an unfair system.
Makes sense.
Now, the blog post also presents the other side of the argument, too.
Okay, what do they say?
Those who want more local control of education, they worry about a one-size-fits-all approach from the federal government.
Like everyone has to follow the same rules, even if they don't make sense for their community.
Exactly. And they're concerned about potentially lowering standards in the name of equality.
That's a valid concern.
They also don't want more political interference in what's being taught in classrooms.
Yeah, nobody wants their kids' education to be a political battleground.
Right. And their big argument is that local communities,
Yeah.
they're better equipped to understand and respond to their students' unique needs.
It's like they know their kids better than some bureaucrat in Washington.
Exactly. So we've got these two opposing camps, right?
The federal intervention folks and the local control folks.
Yep. Classic American tug of war. Individual liberty versus collective responsibility.
And this debate has very real consequences
For sure.
for millions of students and teachers all across the country.
And speaking of teachers, remember that Reddit thread you sent?
The one where teachers are freaking out about the Department of Education potentially going away.
That's the one. Their anxieties really highlight what's at stake here.
I bet they're pretty worried.
Oh, yeah. Those teachers are not holding back. They're terrified of what losing the Department of Education could mean.
Like what?
Everything. Budget cuts, unqualified teachers, dismantling of special education programs.
So it's not just about abstract ideas, it's about their jobs, their students' lives.
Exactly. And it's not even just about the practical stuff.
There's an emotional component too, right?
Definitely. There's this deep sense of feeling undervalued, disregarded by those in power.
Like they're being ignored, their voices aren't being heard.
It's almost like
They're caught in the crossfire of this huge ideological battle that they didn't sign up for.
Exactly. And to really understand their anxieties, we got to grapple with how we even measure the success of our education system.
Which is where that report from the Economic Policy Institute comes in.
You got it. Get ready to dive into the world of international test comparisons.
Oh boy. PISA and TIMS, here we come.
You know those tests, right?
The ones that always tell us how much American students are falling behind the rest of the world.
Yep. Those are the ones.
But I have a feeling this report isn't going to just confirm those doom and gloom narratives.
You're right to be skeptical. This report actually cautions us against taking those international rankings at face value.
Okay, I'm listening.
They argued that those rankings often don't take into account the different socioeconomic situations of the countries being compared.
That makes sense.
Like, the U.S. has a much larger percentage of students from disadvantaged backgrounds compared to a lot of other developed countries.
So we're not really comparing apples to apples.
Exactly.
So are you saying American students might actually be doing better than those international tests suggest?
That's exactly what the report is suggesting. If you adjust for things like poverty and access to resources,
Yeah.
the U.S. student rankings on those tests would probably improve a lot.
It's a good reminder that context matters.
Totally. You can't just look at the numbers without understanding the bigger picture.
Right, like comparing a fish's ability to climb a tree to a monkey's.
Exactly. It's not a fair comparison.
And the report also points out how the content of those international tests can skew the results too.
Like, what kinds of questions are on the test?
Yep. They found that American teens, they tend to do pretty well on algebra questions, but they struggle more with geometry.
Interesting. So the subject matter can actually influence how a country ranks.
Exactly. It's not just about how smart the kids are, it's also about what they've been taught.
So maybe those tests aren't a neutral or objective measure of educational success after all.
That's what the report is arguing, at least.
Makes you think twice about those headlines that scream, American students are falling behind.
Definitely. It's more complicated than that.
So we need to be careful about using those international test scores to make sweeping judgments about American education.
For sure.
But then that brings up another question.
What's that?
If the Department of Education's goal is to ensure equal access to a quality education, how do we even define quality in this context?
Yeah, what does a quality education actually look like?
Is it about test scores, college admissions, getting a good job?
Or is it something more than that?
And that's where that legal analysis from Vanderbilt Law School comes in.
The one about public education as a property right?
Yep, that's the one. It's a whole new way of thinking about educational rights in America.
I'm ready for my mind to be blown.
Okay, buckle up. It's a pretty radical idea.
Okay, lay it on me.
Instead of getting bogged down in the whole debate about whether education is a fundamental right.
Which the Rodriguez case basically said it wasn't.
Right, that's the big one.
San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez.
Yep. This analysis takes a totally different route.
Okay, I'm all ears.
It argues that public education can actually be seen as a property right.
A property right? Like owning a house?
Kind of. But it's protected by the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause.
Whoa, that's getting into some serious legal territory.
It is. Basically, it means states would have a legal obligation to provide a certain standard of education.
To all students.
Yep, no matter their background or where they live.
So instead of education being something the government may provide,
Right.
it becomes something students are entitled to.
Exactly. A big shift in perspective.
Huge. But how does this argument deal with that Rodriguez case?
That's the clever part. It sidesteps the whole debate about whether education is a fundamental right.
Okay, I'm following.
Because the Supreme Court already said it's not.
Right.
But this argument doesn't rely on that at all.
So it's like finding a loophole.
Kind of. It's saying that even if education isn't a fundamental right,
Yeah.
it can still be considered a property right that deserves legal protection.
Ooh, sneaky. But how would that actually work in practice?
Well, the author of this analysis, Matthew Patrick Shaw, he points to this case, Goss v. Lopez.
Another court case.
Yep. And in this case, the Supreme Court actually said that states can create a property interest in public education through their own laws.
So states could basically say, yep, education is a property right here.
Exactly.
That's pretty wild.
It is. And if states do that,
Yeah.
then students could potentially sue states that don't provide an adequate education.
Well, really?
They could argue that their property rights have been violated.
That's a game changer. So it's like suing the state for not delivering on its promise of a good education.
Exactly. It's like a breach of contract, but with education.
Blind, blown.
Right. This idea of education as a property, right?
Yeah.
It has the potential to really shake things up.
No doubt about it. But I'm curious, what do legal experts and policymakers think about all this?
Well, it's a pretty new idea.
True.
So it's too early to say what the long-term impact will be.
Fair enough.
Some legal scholars and education advocates are super excited about it.
They see it as a way to fight for educational equity.
Yep. But others are more skeptical.
What do they think?
They're not sure if it'll hold up in court or if it'll actually lead to real improvements for students.
So we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Exactly. But this is definitely a conversation that's just getting started.
And it's one that we all need to be a part of. You know, it's fascinating to think about all this legal stuff.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about those teachers.
The ones from the Reddit thread.
Exactly. They're the ones dealing with this stuff every day.
It's true. We can get caught up in the big ideas. But this is about real people's lives.
Absolutely.
And those teachers, they're worried.
What are they saying?
They're painting a pretty bleak picture of what happens if the Department of Education disappears.
Like what kinds of things?
They're talking about salary cuts, crumbling classrooms, unqualified teachers coming in.
Wow, so it's not just about losing funding.
Nope, it's about the quality of education taking a nosedive.
Yeah, if you don't have good teachers, you don't have good schools.
Exactly. And they brought up special education programs, too.
Oh, right.
Those often rely heavily on federal support.
So those programs could be in jeopardy.
That's what a lot of them are afraid of.
That students with disabilities would be left behind.
Yeah, it's a real concern.
I can see why they'd be so stressed.
When you read through their comments, it's clear how demoralized they are.
What do they say?
They talk about being overworked, underpaid, constantly second-guessed by everyone.
Like who?
Politicians, administrators, you name it.
So they feel like they're being squeezed from all sides
Exactly. Like they're being asked to do more with less.
and then getting blamed when things go wrong.
It's like a no-win situation.
It sounds exhausting, honestly.
It is, and a lot of them are talking about leaving the profession altogether.
Seriously, like quitting teaching.
Yeah, they're burnt out.
That's a huge problem.
It is. Imagine a mass exodus of experienced teachers.
That would be a disaster for American education.
We're already facing teacher shortages in many parts of the country.
It would only make things worse.
Think about it. Larger class sizes, fewer resources, the quality of instruction just goes down.
It's like a downward spiral.
Exactly. And it's not just about the practical stuff either.
What else is there?
This kind of demoralization, it erodes public trust in our schools.
People lose faith in the system.
If teachers don't feel valued and supported,
Yeah.
how can we expect them to inspire and educate kids?
Good point.
So we've talked about the history, the legal arguments, the policy stuff, and what teachers are experiencing on the ground.
A lot to digest.
It is. Where do we go from here?
That's the million-dollar question.
It feels like we're at a crossroads with all of this.
Yeah, the decisions we make about education now will have a huge impact for years to come.
No pressure, right?
None at all. But, I think the first step is to realize this isn't a simple black and white issue.
Meaning what?
There are valid points on both sides of the argument.
So it's not just about picking a side and sticking to it.
Right. I think there's actually more common ground than we realize.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about the goals we all share.
You mean things like making sure every student has a chance to succeed?
Exactly. Preparing them for the challenges of the future, supporting teachers.
Those are things most Americans can agree on no matter what their political beliefs are.
Exactly. The question is, how do we achieve those goals?
Right. What's the best path forward?
Does a centralized federal approach work best?
With all its standardization and accountability?
Or do we need a more decentralized system?
With states and local communities in charge?
More flexibility, but maybe less equity. Who knows?
It's a tough question.
It is. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
Probably not.
But one thing's clear.
What's that?
The current system, it's not working as well as it could.
We see that in the inequalities, the bureaucracy, the lack of real progress.
So maybe the question isn't whether to keep or eliminate the Department of Education.
But how to fix it?
Exactly. How to make it more effective, more responsive to the needs of students and teachers and families.
Okay, I like that approach, but how do we even start?
It's a big task.
It is. Where do we find the resources, the political will to make real change happen?
Well, I think it starts with honest conversations.
Like, who needs to be talked?
Everyone. Teachers, administrators, policymakers, parents, students, everyone who has a stake in education.
So we need to bring everyone to the table and hash it out.
Exactly. Talk about what's working, what's not working, and how we can create a system that actually serves everyone.
That sounds good in theory, but in our current political climate.
I know, it's tough.
Education is such a political football these days.
Everyone's trying to score points, advance their own agendas.
How do we break free from that?
Well, I think we have to start by recognizing that education isn't a partisan issue.
It's about kids, not politics.
Exactly. It affects all of us no matter our political beliefs.
So if we can frame it that way,
Yeah.
maybe we can find some common ground and actually make some progress.
I love that. Education is a common good.
Something we all have a stake in.
It changes the whole conversation.
It does, but it also makes me wonder, what is a good education?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Is it about test scores and college admissions?
Or is it about something more?
Something harder to measure?
Like what?
Like, I don't know, critical thinking, creativity, being a good citizen.
Philosophers have been debating this for centuries.
They have, but it's at the heart of why this whole debate is so important.
Because education shapes who we are as individuals and as a society.
Exactly. It's not just about learning facts. It's about preparing kids for the future.
A future that's constantly changing.
Right. So we need to get this right.
Absolutely. The decisions we make today will have a ripple effect for generations.
What? No pressure. But it's true. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to be thoughtful about this.
And to be committed to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Well said. And speaking of solutions, let's circle back to that legal analysis from Vanderbilt.
The one about education as a property right?
Yeah.
It's radical, but it's got me thinking.
Me too. It's a fascinating argument.
But before we get into the legal details,
Yeah,
I think it's important to step back and think about the bigger picture.
the philosophical stuff.
Exactly. Like, when most people hear the word property,
Yeah,
they think of physical things, houses, cars, land.
tangible stuff.
But how do you apply that concept to something like education?
That's the cool part. Matthew Patrick Shaw, the author of that analysis, he argues that public education, even though it's not a physical thing...
Right. You can't hold it in your hand.
Exactly. It can still be considered a form of property.
How so?
Because it represents this vested interest that people have in their own development.
Like it's an investment in your future.
Exactly. It's not about owning a classroom or a textbook.
It's about having a right to a good education.
A right that's protected by law.
So it's about owning that right, that entitlement.
And that changes everything.
How so?
Well, Shaw argues that by framing education as a property right...
We can give students stronger legal protections.
Interesting.
And hold states accountable for actually providing a quality education.
So it's like a way to raise the bar for everyone.
Exactly. But you're probably thinking about the Rodriguez case again, right?
Yeah. Didn't the Supreme Court already say that education isn't a fundamental right?
They did, but Shaw's argument is different.
How so?
Rodriguez was all about whether education is a fundamental right.
And the court said it's not.
Right, but Shaw's argument doesn't even rely on that.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's saying even if it's not a fundamental right, it can still be a property. Right.
So he's sidestepping that whole debate.
Exactly. It's pretty clever, legally speaking.
It is. But how would this actually work in real life?
Well, Shaw points to that Goss v. Lopez case again.
The one where the Supreme Court said states can create a property interest in education?
Yep, that's the one.
Okay, so what does that mean for students?
It means they could potentially sue states that don't provide a good enough education.
Seriously, like take them to court.
Yep. They could argue that their property rights have been violated.
That's a big deal.
It is. It gives students and families some real leverage.
To fight for their right to a quality education.
Exactly. And it all hinges on that 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause.
Okay, remind me what those are again.
So the 14th Amendment, it's a big one. It was passed after the Civil War.
To ensure equal rights for everyone.
Exactly. And the Due Process Clause is part of that amendment.
What does it say?
It says the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
So there has to be a fair legal process before they can take something away from you.
Yep. And that includes property.
Okay, so how does that tie back to education?
Well, if a state says education is a property, right?
Through its laws?
Right. Then students have a legitimate claim to a quality education.
And if the state doesn't provide that?
It could be violating their due process rights.
So it's like the state is making a promise.
To provide a good education.
And if they break that promise?
Students can sue. It's a powerful tool.
It is. But has this argument gained any traction in the real world?
It's still pretty new.
True.
So it's hard to say what the long-term impact will be.
Yeah, it could fizzle out or it could be a game changer.
Exactly. Some people were really excited about it.
Oh.
Legal scholars, education advocates, they see it as a way to fight for equity.
But others are more hesitant, right?
Yeah, they're not sure if it'll hold up in court.
Or if it'll actually lead to better schools for kids.
We'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
It's like a legal experiment in progress.
Exactly. And it's a conversation that we all need to be a part of.
It really makes you think, you know?
It does.
This whole idea of education as a property, right?
Yeah.
It could change how we view education as a society.
How so?
Well, if we start thinking of it as something we own, something we have a right to.
It becomes more valuable.
Exactly. Like, it's not just something handed to us.
It's ours.
It's something worth fighting for, protecting.
Something we invest in.
Right. And imagine if we treated education like we treat other things we own.
What do you mean?
Like our homes, our cars.
We take care of them.
We maintain them. We make sure they're in good shape.
We're proud of them.
Exactly. So what if we did that with education?
More funding for schools.
Better support for teachers.
Creating learning environments that really nurture kids.
It's an exciting thought.
It is, and it goes back to those core American ideals about education, you know?
That whole idea of public education being the bedrock of a democratic society.
Exactly. Empowering individuals, creating opportunities for everyone.
It's who we are, or at least who we aspire to be.
But we can't ignore the challenges we're facing.
You're right. The inequalities, the political battles, the lack of trust.
Now, those things are pulling us away from that vision.
Of education as a force for good.
Yeah, it's a constant struggle.
So after all this, after diving deep into all these different perspectives,
What's the takeaway?
what do we want our listeners to remember?
That this whole debate about the Department of Education,
Yeah.
it's not just some abstract political fight.
It's about something bigger.
It's about whether we're truly committed to investing in our kids.
All of them, no matter who they are or where they come from.
Exactly. It's about whether we believe education is a public good.
Something that unites us, something we're all responsible for.
And it's a debate that we all need to be part of.
We can't just sit back and watch.
We need to engage, be thoughtful, be proactive.
Demand better from our leaders, advocate for good policies, hold our institutions accountable.
That's how we make a difference.
You know, this deep dive has been amazing.
It has.
But I gotta admit, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But maybe that's a good thing.
Why?
Because it means we're starting to understand how complex this issue really is.
And how important it is.
Exactly. So as we wrap things up,
Yeah.
here's a question for our listeners.
Hit us with it.
What will you do to ensure that every child has access to a quality education?
An education that empowers them to thrive in this crazy world.
It's a question we all need to wrestle with.
And the answers will shape the future of our nation.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Looking at the way we're taught each day, questions arise in every possible way. Some say change, some say stay, balancing thoughts we hold, come what may. Oh,